this professorship has enabled us to bring the very best law professors to our campus to teach, speak, commune with our students and our faculty and community for several years now. It's been a great, great treat every spring semester, even if it doesn't feel like spring, it is spring semester, to welcome these scholars of national and international prominence, and so it is this year as well. Today you're going to hear from one of the leading scholars on the legal profession, the sociology of law, and globalization. Bryant Garth is the Chancellor's Professor of Law at the University of California, Irvine. He's a graduate of Stanford Law School, where he served as editor-in-chief of the Journal of International Studies. And after graduating, he clerked for a federal district judge and then earned a PhD abroad, and in 1979 joined the faculty of the Indiana University School of Law in Bloomington, where he taught civil procedure, legal profession, international comparative law, and human rights. He wasn't there very long before they made him the dean. He loved it so much that eventually he became a recidivist and took a second deanship later in his career at Southwestern Law School in Southern California. Between then, he engaged in many leadership positions, including service with the American Bar Association and AALS, and also with the American Bar Foundation. He's a prolific scholar who's authored more than 20 books and more than 100 articles. His articles have been published in leading journals. And two of his books, more recently co-authored with E. Desilets, have been recognized by the Law and Society Association as the best of their kind annually. We're really delighted to have Professor Garth here to spend a few days with us, visiting classes, meeting with faculty and students, and it's also good to know that we've given him the occasion to deepen his roots in Cincinnati. You may not know, but his son, Andrew, is a lawyer for the city of Cincinnati and an adjunct professor here at the College of Law. He has a tough act to follow with his dad, but he's doing great. And his daughter-in-law, Angela Potocznik, is that how you pronounce her last name? Is on the faculty here at UC in the philosophy department, where she's doing marvelous work in the philosophy of science, and they have a child, a granddaughter, who has recently turned 1. So Bryant is someone we hope to see here again and again. He's going to address some questions that are very important to us. He'll ask them differently, I suppose, but I might ask, is legal education in crisis? And what are the challenges for those of us who are trying to ensure that students are ready for the practice of law? Not only are they important questions, but you're going to get important insights from someone who's eminently capable to address them. Please welcome warmly to Cincinnati, Bryant Garth.
Thanks, Lou. Well, thank you, Lou, and I'm very honored to be here. I like being in Cincinnati, although I didn't realize that March was going to bring this kind of weather for this particular trip. So here's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to, it's a tough topic. Everybody has strong opinions. There's no absolute right answer. So I'm going to give you an introduction to this debate about law schools and their crises. After the introduction, I'm going to use the slides to show you some data from this project that I've been working on with some others for almost 20 years now, called After the JD. Then I'm going to kind of ask, where are we, what next, what needs to be done, and that, of course, will be speculative and controversial, and there should be plenty of time for questions. So I'm going to start just by saying, how I even got to this debate. It's not my natural scholarly place, but I was dean at Southwestern at a time when there was this proliferating scholarship about the crisis of law schools that was particularly aimed at the sort of the lower tiers of the law schools. And I found a speech by a Southwestern dean in the 1930s that was exactly what was happening now. He said that law is a declining profession, they say, because they're outsourcing. We have workmen's comp tribunals. We have this development of administrative law. There are all these reasons why the future of the legal profession is not all that bright. And the conclusion of much of this literature was that what we should do is we should shut down the lower ranked schools. And so what he said was, hey, our graduates serve individuals. There's still plenty of need for lawyers who serve individuals. So let's make this debate, a little more enlightened. So that kind of inspired me to think a little bit about the crisis in present day. I've also studied lawyers for a long period of time, and I know they engage in hyperbole and aggressive advocacy, and they build their reputations by seizing on issues and exaggerating them greatly. I also was working on this after the JD project, which we'll talk about, and so I had some data that seemed to belie some of the things that were being said by the commentators. But I knew that in the 1930s, and it's been true today, it takes a little while for the reaction to settle in, for the reasonable minds to prevail, for the career to regain its same luster. But I was confident that it would happen. And my bottom line, which is a kind of legal sociology point, is that, and I'll come back to that, if lawyers control both sides of the debate about whether law is a good profession, it's a good profession because we own the terms of the debate. And that's where it's going to kind of end up. Now, is there a crisis now? You bet there is. Because, by definition, there's this huge decline in applications, roughly something like 50% over the last couple of years. Some schools are accepting virtually everybody who applies. There's also a relatively slow growth in the market for legal services. As you all know, there's outsourcing, there are all these new competitors, and there's basically lots of competition with lawyers. So it's a hard day, Dean Bilionis, to be a dean of a law school because there is this perception of crisis and you have to do things to adjust to that market. There's also, and the students in the room know this very well, there's the issue of debt. And how does that juxtapose with starting jobs and salaries? Bryant has made a field day out of this in his book called Failing Law Schools. And what Bryant has pointed out in particular, and I want to come back to this, is that he says 50% of the law schools, a third of the law schools have 50% or fewer of their graduates getting law jobs. Now that's, of course, hyperbole because it's not that they never get law jobs. He just points out they don't have law jobs 9 months after graduation. The Tamanaha rhetoric really dominated the debate. It's in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. Paul Campos basically made his reputation out of this debate. And the idea is that the model of law school education is broken. Something needs to be done drastically to fix it. Why is it broken? It's broken because you have runaway, self-indulgent management of law schools by professors who teach less and less, write more and more interdisciplinary, frivolous, self-indulgent scholarship. The whole thing is funded by this pyramid scheme of student loans, and something needs to be done to shape it up. So that's the kind of place where we are. The ABA kind of bought into this rhetoric, created a task force on the crisis in legal education, and it really started out initially with this idea that, indeed, the system is broken. We really need to do something. Now, interestingly, the school that I'm teaching at now, University of California at Irvine, was the subject of a vitriolic attack by Bryant. What Brian says in his book is, here was the chance to create a no-frills, inexpensive law school, and instead they created another expensive law school aspiring to elite status and all of that. And of course, the dean, Chemerinsky, responded and said, well, thank you, Brian, for your advice. So you wanted us to create an absolutely mediocre third-rate law school. Well, that's not our ambition. And that tells you something about the level of the debate. Oops. Do I need to do something on that? It's not a touch screen, I imagine. Good work. Okay, and the Tamanaha critique is essentially, and this is why we want to look at the after the JD data, the Tamanaha critique essentially is, here's the deal. If you borrow for your legal education and you are not sure that you're going to get a corporate law job, the proposition doesn't work because you won't be able to pay back your debt. You might have a kind of optimism bias where you think you're going to be at the top of the class, but only 10% are going to be in the top 10% of the class. You will have buyer's remorse because you paid too much for this education and it's not giving you something. So that's basically the model that he proposes. So let's take a look now at the After the JD data. After the JD is a project that we've been working on basically for 20 years. It's following 5,000 lawyers from the class of 2000, admitted to the bar in the year 2000, for the first 13 years of their career. It's funded, and I have to put the funders up, by the American Bar Foundation, the NALP Foundation, National Science Foundation, and it's been funded also by LSAC in various places. And so let's look at the data. This is why it's good to look at it. These are the only data on whether law is a good career that are out there. The only national data. So my argument is anybody who wants to say law is a bad degree has to respond to this data. Now, you can come up with some responses, and we'll talk a little bit about it, but you've got to at least address it. So we start, this is the methodology, and it just tells you that this is one of those studies that has a very good response rate. It's systematic. It costs us more than $1 million each time we go into the field to do this project. So it's serious research. And the Wave 3 data, which I'm going to report on along with Waves 1 and 2, it was collected in 2012. The actual report, I'm not allowed to put this in your materials, these slides, because the report won't actually be issued until mid-April. So these are, in a sense, preliminary, but they're very close to what the final data will be. There's the response rates. So the first thing is, where do they work? And this feeds into part of the Tamanaha and other critiques, because you'll notice that increasingly it starts out with 22% in public, 68% in private, and only 8.4% in business. But now we're up to 28% are in business. So one of the assumptions of the debate is that, is it a bad thing if lawyers are in business? Does that mean they made a mistake getting a law degree? And we'll look at that as we go through the slides. And I will go pretty fast through the slides. There's other data on them that are interesting, but if I stop and just ponder and reflect on them, we'll never finish this. What this tells you, this is waves 1, 2, and 3. And note the Tamanaha, Campos, et cetera, picture is the big law firm is the key to you paying back your debt. Okay? So look, it turns out that at the starting point, we've got 18% in the biggest law firms of more than 250, another 7% over 100, so 25% starting in firms of more than 100. By the time we get to wave 2, that's 15%, and by the time we get to wave 3, that's 11%. So those who start there don't stay that long. A lot of them leave very quickly. And you'll see that even of that 8.4%, some of those are not people who started there. Those are some people who moved there from other settings. So the first point is the first job can't be the key. And indeed, our group here, by year 13, the average person has had 4 jobs. This tells you the other settings, and again, you have that business not practicing is the one I want to highlight here. It has gone from 4 to 8 to 14%. So there is increase of business. So is that a question of good thing or a bad thing with a law degree? And then you see the other business side, which is business practicing law, has gone from 4% to 8% to 14%. So that's your in-house type position. This is an impossible to read diagram, but I think the yellow parts kind of highlight that there's some continuity. Where you start has a lot to do with where you are 13 years into your career. But what it also tells you is that there are changes, there's mobility in every direction. And I think what's kind of interesting is to see that in every area, the number of those who are in the same position they started is greater. It's not everybody, but it's greater, except for one, and that is, and this is not about whether law is a good degree, it's just an interesting tidbit, which is that those who start in the large law firms, more of them are now in-house than are still with the large law firms, telling you the desirability of that career as compared to the big lawyers. Now, part of the argument, again, of Tamanaha and many others is that if you don't go to a top whatever school, then you've made the bad decision because you won't get into the corporate law firms, you won't pay back your debt, and all of that. So this introduces the U.S. News rankings from the year 1998, which then fits our students, our graduates. And you see for sure that in the largest law firms, 55% of those in the top 10 are starting their jobs in those positions. And as you get down to tiers 3 and 4, 8% and 4%. So if you look at that wave 1, let's say you look at the top 10 is 55%, okay? Tier 3 is 8%. Now we go to time 2. Tier 3 is now up to 10% of the tier 3. And those who went to the most elite schools are down to half, 28%, which tells you that those who don't go to the highest ranked schools have a little more tenacity in the large law firm settings because they're a little bit hungrier. They earn their way in with grades, but they're doing well. And as you come to year 3, the figures are more or less stable. The tier 3 has gone down a bit, but the top schools now at 16%. You also see, for what it's worth, and this is just another little insight, is what do you think is the most elitist part of the American legal profession? Well, you can see that the federal government is one, but the most elitist is where we are now, in education. That's the place where they put the most premium on elite credentials. This is just to show you that there's not a whole lot of difference by race and ethnicity. So you might, if you want to know whether the profession is good for particular groups or not, what's interesting is just to see that the African American in government percentage is a particularly high one, and we could talk about why that is, but that's not really the theme of today's talk. And this tells you the percent of changes, and it's just, are you making partner? If you're going to trying to make partner, because year 13 is about the time that partnership is really fish or cut bait. And what's kind of interesting at this point, because you're asking, is it a good career for all ethnicities? What kinds of biases are left in the profession? You see that, again, if you start at solo, you see there's a big increase by the Asian category and the Hispanic category, a decrease in the African American, and then when you come to the large law firms, what you see is that there's a huge kind of Asian exodus from large law firms between years 9 and years 13. And I'll let you just think about why that might be, but it's an interesting phenomenon suggesting that what looks like everybody's on the path to success at year 9, when it comes to making partner, law firms are much more likely to reproduce themselves than reproduce minorities. This is percent not practicing law, and you can see that's at 20% now, has gone up a bit. This is the demographics, because you might think, who's not practicing law? Does that relate to which schools you went to? Again, on the theory that maybe you have the advantages that come from the highest schools is so big. And you see that there's really not a difference in the percentage that are not practicing law. These are median incomes, and I did it by gender, partly just to show you that there are huge and increasing gender imbalances in the profession that are still absolutely there. But you see the salaries are not bad in this group 13 years into their profession. The solos is fairly low, and this is everyone. Let's go to full-time. It's a little easier, and you can see that there still the solo is relatively low, but it goes all over the place. And you see that business not practicing, the women's side is much lower than the men's side, which is, again, quite interesting, and we have some theories on it that we can talk about. And then the other point is that the business practicing law is a very high salary. That's a very coveted piece of your lawyer careers. We did earnings by race, and I think I put this in here because I just think it's quite interesting that the Asian and Hispanic medians are much higher than white and African American. And what that suggests is there is still very much a niche in American legal practice for language-specific solo practice careers, where you're serving a community that can speak your language. And this doesn't show any big differences, but it just shows that there's not major differences among ethnicity and the salaries in these sectors as well. So this is another one that kind of addresses the crisis, the don't go to law school unless you're sure that you're going to get a corporate job. What this tells you is that indeed the grades do matter. Where you went to law school does matter, but that especially down through the Tier 3, and there would be exceptions in Tier 4, this is not, the categories are not rigid. You see that having high grades matters a lot, having at least to be average. So the one thing you can always do for your graduates is make the grade inflation even higher, because the more people that graduate with that B average, this suggests the better jobs they're going to get. Now, it can't be that simple, of course, but it's fun to think about it. And there I think, was one student in the top 10, because they grade a little easier, who was below a 3.0, and look, the person was making $254,000, so it was interesting. So this is the issue of how are they handling debt? Now, I'll come back to that, but one of the things is it's clear that our group had less debt in 2000 than you have if you graduated in 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14. So debt was less, but still substantial. And what you see is the medians at wave 1 were 70. They've gone down to 54 and 50. And you see the percentages of zero debt have gone up to close to 50% by wave 3. And that those with more than 100,000 debt by wave 3 is relatively small, but still there, about 5%. And what's a little bit troubling is you do see that there is more debt for the African American graduates than for the other categories, a little bit less for Hispanic, and there's still more of that 100,000 plus debt in those groups. So there is a debt burden. But the general story of how did this group handle debt is 15%, 35%, 48%. The debt is being paid. And remember, this is the only data on how lawyers are managing their careers. Now you ask by tier, and you see an impact. That the very top schools have paid back a little more debt, but it's not a dramatic difference when you look across the categories. Now we come to this is another impossible one to decipher, but we asked all these graduates, at all 3 stages of their careers, this is the question of buyer's remorse. Are they sad that they went into the legal profession? And remember, they also had to live through a pretty tough recession. You see that basically all the categories on a 7-point scale are essentially higher than 5. The one that is lower, which is the one on the top, shouldn't really be in this scale because that's really only on a 5-point scale, which is the satisfaction with the decision to be a lawyer. So that's 4 out of 5. And we'll come back to that one. Then we have, and I want to go through these quickly, we've created some composites, which are the substance, how much you like the kind of work you do, the power track, which is your perspective of what your future is going to be, what recognition you get, and your satisfaction with your salary and its prospects for the future. And then we have job setting, which is how many hours you work, is it too much, too many demands on your time. And the social index is how diverse is your workplace, how much time do you have for pro bono activities. And I'm going to skip through the definitions of them. Oh, no, here we got So what we do is on each one, essentially the power track, that makes sense for large law firms, and it's still very good for large law firms. That totally makes sense. In terms of job setting, as you would expect, this one's the power track. The first is the substance of work, and you see that nonprofits and governments, they like their substance the best. And then you get to the power track, and naturally it makes sense that large law firms are high on the power track. I'm going to go really fast through this, as you can see. Then we come to the job setting, and you're not surprised that when you now come to the large law firms, the job setting, your hours and everything, is really low compared. And these are all fairly positive. What this is how they vary from the overall average positive numbers. So what you see relatively to the other settings, the large law firm, they are less happy with their job setting. And I'll just put in this social index. And what I want to point out, the whole point of putting these on here, is that in contrast to waves 1 and waves 2, at wave 3, on all 4 of our categories, which are kind of composite measures of lawyer satisfaction, if you look now at the solo practitioner on the far left of the scale, you see that they are winners in all 4 categories, which means that at year 13, those who are into the solo practice setting, even though they're not making a lot of money, have the kind of flexibility, autonomy, good prospects for the future that makes them believe that they've made actually a pretty good career decision. So this is actually a big surprise to us. And one of the things we've been doing is we don't want to just rely on the data. So we go out and we interview lawyers. And we've interviewed now 5 or 6 solo practitioners just at random. And we do find a kind of a story of really, kind of making their way, which we think is quite interesting. Just a couple more slides. This is kind of the overall, if you had to do it again, would you do it? And you see that out of the 5-point scale, it's steady around 4. And out of the 7-point scale, it's steady around 5.5. The AJD3 mean on if you had to do it again, would you do it? And we've interviewed people. And I think the way they interpret that is, would they do it today, given the rhetoric that's out there? And so that's a little bit lower than the others. This is by setting in just the pure satisfaction with decision to be a lawyer. And again, it just shows high numbers essentially across the board. If you peek, you can see that business practicing, again, that in-house position, for those of you thinking about where you might want to practice, that's a high number there. Let's see. And then we did it by law school rankings. Are you satisfied with your decision to become a lawyer? And you see almost no difference among the tiers. And it makes sense because even though, as you can see, the actual outcomes of those who went to the lower ranked schools are not probably as high as they are on the average with those who went to the highest ranking schools, typically those who went to the lower ranking schools came farther. They started with more disadvantage. And so they are pleased that they have arrived somewhere where they didn't anticipate they would be. Good career investment, same, and look there, there's quite a cluster of numbers around 7. Had to do it again, you see the same kind of a story. And then this was just, we asked how people weathered the recession, and it reminds us that even though the recession brought a huge crisis in getting first jobs, our group fared very well during the Depression. There were issues, there were layoffs in their offices, but most did not have a big dramatic impact. And I won't go through that more. So that's the last of the show and tell on after the JD. And now I kind of want to just reflect a little bit about that and then talk about where we are. First of all, if you take the criticism, and now you look at these slides, and if the criticism is you've got it, that corporate job is everything that matters, look, they're not staying, and the corporate lawyers are no less happy or no more happy than others. They talk about debt, and what you see, our group is succeeding pretty well in their debt. And if you see the Simkovich slide that I have in some materials, you also see that the rate of default has been very low. The hierarchies that are talked about in the literature are there, but they're not crucially determining people's careers. There's satisfaction all the way around. And there are even some surprises. The solo firm, which we think is a difficult place to survive, seems to be pretty content. Business, remember the criticism is that going into business is a failure. Why would you get a law degree if you're going to go into business? The salaries are good, the satisfaction is good as well. It's normal. And then I can't resist just pointing out that, of course, there are still gender and race issues out there, especially gender in the legal profession, but those are not really the subject of the critiques. That just shows, the profession. Some of the areas that need a whole lot of work are areas that are not part of the major critique. So here's the question. These data, the best data available, are from graduates starting their practice in the year 2000. So the question is, does it apply to a set of graduates in a bad economy, and maybe now an emerging better economy, who have higher tuition, higher debt, and supposedly a new ball game in terms of corporate hiring? So the question then is, how did we get to this place where we have such high tuition and such high debt? And this is in one of the articles that I wrote, but the best economic analysis suggests that we got into this position because competition increased among the law schools in the United States. And as they competed, the students did not really shop on the basis of tuition. Students, undergraduate and graduate, law school, other departments as well, tended to look and see what are the programs, what are the facilities, is there a gym, is there student housing? They started, and law schools, the arms race in law schools started because of an increased, not a decreased competition. So the competition, as happened for undergraduates, made it so schools were spending because students were not making their decision on the basis of price. Schools were spending in order to show students they had programs that would give them a better education. So it's not, as some suggest, self-indulgent professors just publishing more, teaching less. It's actually part of a process. So the basic point is that where we are today, in contrast to 30 years ago, is we are in a very competitive marketplace where law schools compete. So what to make of that? What does that mean for the current crisis? Applications are down. The rhetoric about law school is off. There's a clamoring for some kind of reform, either deregulate or re-regulate somewhere along the way. So what do we think we should do? One solution is get rid of the third year. I'll say a little bit about that in a second. Another solution is to make law school a little more practical. Now that may cost a little more money, but the idea of a law school being a little more practical is, in an economy where more people are going to start in solo and small firms, perhaps, it's a premium for law schools to be able to get students who are better able to commence their legal practice knowing something about the practice. So that's one. You could regulate that if you wanted to. Another solution is just to wait it out. Just say the applications will be back. It will rebound. The trouble is, in today's market, when the applications are not yet rebounded, you've got to act. A third solution, which is kind of buying off of the kind of Tamanaha critique, is kind of hinted at in the ABA Task Force report, which just came out a little bit ago. What they suggest is that, and they don't really say it as a regulation, but they say, law professors should not be fighting so much for the prestige that comes with scholarship. There should be less of law professors just trying to get that prestige. Why do they need to have prestige? Why don't they just teach and make good lawyers? So that's the suggestion. And this is my complex point, so I hope you'll bear with me on it. This is a sociological point. If you take a field, so we'll call it the legal field, which is basically what gets you ahead in the legal profession. What are kind of the hierarchies, the conduct that gets rewarded? If you take the legal field, something that is valued in a field probably serves the field. Something that is rewarded in the field probably serves the field. So an example of that would be pro bono and public service by lawyers. They are rewarded. They get better clients, they get promoted, they get more recognition in the profession if they do that. And it makes sense because it makes law look better. It makes lawyers look better. It makes the whole process look more legitimate. So what I want to argue is that producing scholarship is rewarded in the profession, and therefore it also, we hypothesize, serves the profession. It's not just prestige. So how does it serve the profession? What it is law professors at basically all law schools are competing. They're competing with each other. They're competing to produce legalized solutions to social, economic, political problems. They compete for that, and by competing for that, they keep law in the strongest position among the professions in the United States, and it keeps the U.S. law in a strong position globally among other countries. Because this constant production of legal solutions, which draw on the campus, they draw on economics, they draw on sociology, political science, business, means that law professors and lawyers are the key people in implementing the social and economic change, and that's what attracts people into law, and that's what makes law the strongest place to be in the U.S. And you can see that in many areas, and I won't go into those many areas, but you'll have to take it on faith for the moment. But what that suggests is that it would not be a good idea to try to regulate in a way that kills the production of legal scholarship. And to kind of build that point, it's quite interesting that if you go around the world, and this is kind of my next project, you find reforms in legal education abroad, Brazil, India, Germany, Paris, many, many places, Japan, Korea, are drawing on the U.S. model of legal education and legal scholarship. And what are they emphasizing? What is the thing that they think is most important? It's to have full-time professors. They're more expensive, but have full-time professors producing full-time scholarship. And why is that? Because they think they absolutely need that production to put their law, their legal profession, their lawyers in a secure place to compete in the global economy. So one of my articles of faith, which I think can be demonstrated, is that we shouldn't just limit scholarship. This is essentially what the ABA task force suggests to the most elite schools. The production of scholarship should be encouraged everywhere, and indeed, sometimes the best ideas, the best solutions to social problems come from scholars outside of the very so-called top schools because they're more creative. They're more willing to take some risks. They're more willing to write something that is provocative. The other thing that is my article of faith for where we should go in the legal profession, which is also, in a way, anti-regulation, is I don't want somebody to say, you who are not in the top, and you can always draw your line where you want to make the top, but you who are not at the top you should not have the ambition of training corporate lawyers and leaders of the profession. You should have a 2-year degree. You should have a kind of streamlined, pass-the-bar education, and your graduates should be second-class lawyer citizens. And since the most access into the profession by disadvantaged groups comes from the law schools that are lower on the hierarchy, I think that's killing the law as a ticket for upward mobility for many social groups in the U.S. So those are the two things that I don't like as potential reforms at all. So, okay, then you say, well, what should we do to save legal education? Because the tuition is going up, the debt is going up, the jobs have not rebounded as fast. And this is not my natural thing to say, but I think we've bought into competition, and competition is the only way we get out of this. That it's going to happen. We're not going to like all the impacts of competition, but it's going to make the relevant change happen. Now, how is that going to happen? Well, if you think about what it takes to compete in the rankings, what it takes to raise the money to compete at all those levels, you'll see that the arms race is going to change character, and already probably has changed character. So if you look at tuition increases, remember students were not savvy on tuition increases in the past. Well, they're going to be more so now. So there will be law schools that are going to be limited to 2%, 3%, whatever, for the foreseeable future, and that's going to be noticed in the competition for students. And they're not going to want to add too many more students because that cuts them down in the rankings if they have to lower their credentials. So we'll have law schools that have low tuition increases, and then the Harvards and Yales will be able to increase their tuition by whatever they want, as they have in the past, which means they can plow more and more resources into their students, which means that there is a kind of growing gap, but they're at least still, and I like this, along the same continuum. Things like teaching loads, which again is supposedly self-indulgent, they will change. Because the school that can't raise the tuition by all those numbers will then say, we need a little more teaching out of our faculties, and they'll get more. They will also have more people who are not scholars, who are not on the tenure track, doing the teaching, participating in the academic life of the school. And that's what happened with undergraduates as well. So you can see some of those things that are actually being suggested by the regulatory reformers are going to happen, but they'll happen slowly, differentially, because it won't just be at the top of the rankings versus the bottom of the rankings. Whether you can compete in academic scholarship, whether you compete in hiring more people, will depend on the resources you get from your alumni, whether they hire you, whether they give money back. It'll depend on the resources that you can raise, the faculty you can hire. So it will be differential. It won't just be according to the rankings, and I think that that's a better way, rather than trying to, as they did in the Depression, use it as an excuse to say we're going to beat up on the schools that are not highest ranked. So I think we can expect increasing competition, winners and losers, and big swings. Because the big swing now, this radical cut in the size of classes that has taken place in response to lower applications, is partly in response to lower applications, but it's also a response to how competitive our world is. Every school cuts by many more than it has to pay its bills, because they want to have the credentials that still make them look as good as they possibly can in U.S. News. So in a way, you're going to get bigger swings in the future, and I think that's almost inevitable. So the last 2 points, and then we go to questions, is also don't give up on legal demand. I haven't talked about this, but if you look at the history of law in the United States, big companies didn't sue big companies until the 1970s and 1980s. So big litigation was not even an important practice in most of the Wall Street firms. That changed. Litigation became this major field, and that increases a huge demand for legal services that could not have been predicted by any kind of federal office, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or anybody else. It happened. You can point to other examples. Corporate bankruptcy didn't exist, was not a practice area of corporate law firms until there was bankruptcy reform. And then what do? You hire the bankruptcy lawyers who were in the small firms, who didn't graduate from the fanciest schools, who were from the ethnic groups that had not been represented in big law firms, and they came in, changed the practice, also increased the demand. You can do that with a whole range of areas, intellectual property is another. So we have an entrepreneurial legal profession that colonizes new areas of social life. When there's a new social problem, lawyers figure out a way to turn it into law, and when they turn it into law, it turns into legal practice, it increases demand. So the notion that the demand, you see those projections, there will be X number of jobs, those have never been good in the past, so don't expect them to be good in the future. I don't guarantee that the future is increasing demand. There are counter pressures, but we should recognize that there's a lot going on demand. So this is the economy we live in. It's complex. It's hard to succeed, but that's true of all the professions. So the bottom line of this is simply, even though I was dragged into the debate about whether law is a good education, I couldn't write about it when I was at Southwestern because I would have been apologizing for Southwestern in a certain way. But once I got over to Irvine, then I decided to accept a few invitations to write on this, and now I'm afraid I'm into it. But the point simply is law and legal education is still a great place to be nationally and globally. We're in a market, there'll be fluctuations, but if you can think of a better degree to maximize your opportunities in a super competitive economy, then I'd like to know what it is. So thank you. Yes.
In your after the JD study, did you gather any data about how lawyers reflected upon their legal education? Was 3 years too much, too little, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, we did. And it was interesting because we asked if 3 years was too much or too little. And what we found is the paradox compared to the debate today, because what happened was those who went to the most elite schools said, well, yeah, maybe 3 years is too much. Whereas the reformers suggested it should be for the non-elite schools. And also those in the large law firms were more likely to say that 3 years is too much. What it basically meant was the most arrogant group said that 3 years was too much. Males were more likely than females as well. But it was not a high percentage in any event. Mm-hmm.
I passed the bar in 1974 and retired in 2051, happy with whatever money I had and not feeling like I wanted to work. If I listen to what you said so far, I'd be really discouraged about going out to be a lawyer because if I listen carefully, it almost feels like, whoa, I did go to Holland. And if I go to a big firm, I won't be there long. Oh, me. Well, big firms hire 10 people on the intention of keeping one. And they rotate through because they're looking for one out of this year class and one out of that year class. And pretty soon they're down to the few people that they actually want. If I were given your speech, what I would say the value of law school is something like, what's the productivity of a lawyer? Why do people keep us around? I would say that law school is valuable because of the skill set that we get that most other people don't get. One of those things is that after a fashion, we learn how to think, we're aware of things, and we learn how to observe, at least mentally, if not physically. We can take those observations and we analyze the facts that are in them. We somehow learn to write or speak or communicate in some manner. And we can articulate like an action plan from the things that we think about. Those things you can get whether you're at Harvard or wherever, because that's the individual component of that education. And when you get out into the real world, the fancy Tier 1 and Tier 4, pretty soon people ask, what did you do for me yesterday, and what do you intend to do tomorrow? And that's much of the leveling that shows in your chart.
Yeah, and really, I'm totally on your side on this. There's always a danger when you present the hierarchies that it sounds like you're like validating them and saying that, because corporate law firms are kind of an indicator of jobs and because Harvard is at the top of the heap and there are some advantages, but actually what I'm trying to make is exactly the opposite point, that at year 13, those who did not go to Harvard are just as happy as those who went to Harvard, have just as high indicators of success, including if they are working at a small firm or in solo practice, and that in fact the hierarchy should be ignored, and that those who are outside of corporate practice are actually doing well and thriving. So that I'm really glad you asked the question because when you make a presentation like this, people then see the advantage. There is some advantage, but it's not near the advantage that people were proclaiming in this debate, who are essentially saying unless you're independently wealthy or you get admitted to Harvard, don't go to law school. which is so much the wrong advice because indeed that set of skills that you talk about are skills that will continue to play very well in an economy that is highly legalized, in a state that is highly legalized, and in a world that is increasingly highly legalized. So I think you should still go to law school if you want to do it again.
If you were advising a family member, your grandchild or something like that, and they wanted to go to law school, what would you tell them? I mean, what would be your direction in terms of high tier, low tier, future career, to go or not to go, an MBA? You know, what would you tell them?
I'm very much a go to law school, you know, and I think I would say if you get offered money, a scholarship by a school that is ranked, you know, 20, 30, take the scholarship. You know, that's just a smart thing to do. But I would say go, and we've interviewed now 40 people who have gone to year 2013, and one of the questions we asked them is, you must be in a position now where people ask you if you should go to law school. What do you say? And virtually all of them say, I would do it again. And then we say, well, what do you advise your niece and nephew when they're talking about law school? And the one thing they say that is interesting, and this is about probably life in general in the US among the professions now, is they say, I need to tell them that you have to work really hard in this career. And that's kind of interesting. Mm-hmm.
I don't know exactly how to ask this question because I'm really stupid about math, but could you please, if you are able to, compare the sort of rate of debt over time? I mean, I'm thinking about my dad who went to school under GI Bill, but still racked up some significant debt, and as a percentage compared to now. Is there a way to do that?
Oh, sure. And I think in the materials there's something that, you know, Bryant Tamanaha's materials show that because he wants to discount the value of the AJD for what you're looking at today. So he takes our group and he shows that their average debt was whatever it was, 70, 80,000, and then compares it to the 150 today and says it's a new ball game. You know, the debt is there. The trouble is we don't yet, first of all, there's not high default rate, even among those of the past few years who have gone through a horrible recession. Simkovich, who I haven't talked about, but I've got some materials in there, you know, has actually, as part of his counterattack, suggested that the premium value on a law degree even goes beyond that debt. But it's true, the debt problem, which is the higher education problem, not just a law school problem, that higher education problem is something that is weighing down, you know, a lot of different people. The question, though, is, do you say, I don't incur that debt, and I abandon my chances to really make it in this world, or do you take on that debt? And I would say if you don't have any other choice, and there are, you know, maybe these loan forgiveness and income-based repayments will stay. I don't have 100% faith, but at least they're there for the time being. I would say, you know, get that debt. And, you know, there are, you know, you can't really say this too much out loud, but there are people who are in solo practices or just beginning who don't have any kind of, you know, great options. But what do is they pay back what they can, and they manage to stave it off at least for the foreseeable future. Not a great option, but it happens. Mm-hmm.
Would you say the increasing amount of debt influences the selection of jobs? Like, because we do become more dependent on what sellers are able to provide to pay back these loans. It seems like it might limit the types of skills that we have all.
We have a few little tidbits of information. I mean, one is that we know that if you have zero debt, you are just as likely to go into a corporate law practice as if you have substantial debt. And why is that? And I think that is because there's a certain prestige, a certain resume value of that corporate law. For what it's worth, you don't have to buy that, but it plays out in the profession. But when you talk to those in public interest jobs and say, has loan forgiveness affected your choice? Many, a high percentage will say that loan forgiveness has affected the choice. And then this is a kind of a odd little thing, but interesting in terms of the data. One of our scholars, Rebecca Sandifer, who's part of the After the JD team, is very interested in what gets people to go into public service and pro bono work. And she found that, you know, it's a little bit sad, but a little bit understandable that those who go into public interest work are likely to have higher income earning spouses than those who do not. One more? Going. Yep. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all, and we're adjourned.
Thank you.
Nice work.
That worked out all right? Yeah.
Yeah, it was very nice.